I would hate to find myself where this character is. This is Inktober Day 7, Drip, and this same little sorceress girl finds herself in an old abandoned building, the wooden floors of which are eaten away with some kind of mysterious goo or acidic liquid. She's peering down a hole as this aforementioned liquid pools and then disintegrates the floor, falling into an abyss below. How odd it is that we so often draw and sketch things that are so uncomfortable for us in real life. So many artists have a tendency to draw spiders even though they're scared of them, or draw characters leaping from the clouds when they find themselves terrified of heights. We as artists are a weird bunch. We tend to illustrate and focus on things that scare us or horrify us, or perhaps things that horrify the populace. There's something strange in being an artist and bringing things to life, sometimes things that we would never actually want to see in our own existence. It's a strange dichotomy for sure. But it's always been this way, hasn't it? Haven't artists from time immemorial chosen to put themselves into situations that in reality they would avoid like the plague? Authors sometimes get accused of what is called a self-insert, writing themselves or the character that they wish they could be into their stories. Sometimes this shows up as a character who is simply too proficient, too knowledgeable, too likable, too attractive compared to everyone else in the story. It's an interesting thing. We like to put ourselves into situations that perhaps we are terrified of, but we feel like if only I had this ability or this confidence, I would be able to combat this. If only I too was a little sorceress girl, I would not be afraid of the dark. I would not be afraid of the deep places of the world. But alas, that's not my fate. And so here I am illustrating this simple drawing with a girl who is happily exploring things that would terrify cautious me. And maybe this is the beauty of video games, the beauty of movies, of novels, of art in general, all of which are pieces of and part of the art world. Perhaps there's something intriguing and interesting and beneficial in that, in our exploration of things that are foreign to us, things that are scary. Is this not why some people like horror films? I mean, genuinely, I'm asking because I can't handle them at all. But I've been told by people who really enjoy horror movies that it's something about that situation, about being able to vicariously live through those people, about not being in that terrible situation but seeing it from afar, that draws them to the genre. I understand it in some sense, but only in the abstract. I'm quite wimpy when it comes to scary things, especially if it's suspense. I have less of an issue with gore, with blood, and with violence, although probably I should have just as much an issue with those things, but suspense I cannot detach from. It's actually gotten to the point where I don't watch very many films anymore because I have a tendency to over-empathize with characters in the film. Now, obviously this would extend to horror situations, but Ben Stiller is perhaps one of the most egregious ones for me. Any of his acting, he acts as these silly characters who are very unaware of their situations, and it makes me so anxious to watch because he's just walking headlong into issue after issue after issue that should be able to be avoided by anyone with any mild sense of logic, and yet, to the humor of most fans, he walks headlong into these situations, and I just can't deal with it. I can't deal with that sense of humor. I struggled with The Office for the same reason, because it was just so obvious what most of the characters were getting themselves into that I just couldn't detach. I was on edge the whole time, anxious for the characters, anxious about the characters, and just want to jump out a window and get away from it. This is so uncomfortable. I know that's not super common perhaps, but if there's anything weird like that that makes you uncomfortable when you watch TV shows that you think is a little quirky, share it in the comments down below. It'll help me feel a little less awkward, but only a little bit, about my particular situation and aversion to watching most TV shows and movies these days. But art is such a wonderful exploration of things that we can't touch. I think this is also why so many of us love video games, why we love fantasy and science fiction, because they are innately explorations of things that we can't do. I'm playing through Elden Ring again. I don't even know what playthrough this is now, and I'm embodying a different character. I'm actually playing a character that's modeled after the one that you're seeing me draw in this session. And it's really intriguing. I've played the game so many times. I'm still discovering new things because it's an amazing game and there's just so much breadth to it. But there's something about embodying a particular character. I might get a really cool weapon, but I'm not going to use it because that's not what this character would do. I'm living in the narrative in some capacity. You see this a lot with role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, both of which I've partaken in. We're learning how to do Pathfinder right now. It's a steep learning curve coming from D&D 5e. D&D 5e was much easier to wrap my head around, and it made more innate sense. And if you've been playing Baldur's Gate or anything like that recently, they're very similar systems. From my understanding, I haven't touched Baldur's Gate yet, but I'll get a chance to this winter, I think. Anyway, there's a need or a desire or just a pleasure that comes from playing as a character, living out that role. I do this, and I think many people do when they read fantasy novels as well. You get into the characters, you're intrigued by how the things in that world works. And that's why world building is so important in all of those situations, because if there are things that kick you out of that world, things that make it hard to feel like you're being a part of it or that it's accurate, then it removes you from it. Consistency is important, and I think it comes back to we're just not all that grown up. We like to think we've grown up, but at the end of the day, I think most of us are still little kids who are excited to explore and excited to try out new things. Video games, stories, art, all of these things just allow us to do that. And they're more culturally appropriate, right? You often get shamed for spending all your time working on art or shamed for spending all your time in video games, but who shames people for reading too much? I'm sure it happens, but it's seldom the case. In fact, I have a friend who read tremendously as a kid because that was the only way to escape everything else, because their parents and their family were very hesitant to let them play video games or to engage in things that were seen as fantasy in nature. But books are academic, books are intellectual, and that was fine. It was okay for them to engage in that. And even for myself, when I was young, I got in trouble a lot because I was so legalistic and so literal that I would follow the rules to the T, and then I would suffer the consequences. Sometimes I would choose not to follow them because the consequences were so well delineated that I would simply make the choice that I wanted to make and then punish myself, much to my mother's chagrin. She worked so hard. She's a wonderful, saintly woman, but I was a very difficult child to punish because it made logical sense to me and I didn't fight it. All that to say, in all of my times of getting grounded and in trouble when I was a child, my mother never took my books away. And I don't seem to have any memories of her taking my sketchbooks or pencils away either. Those were always seen as tolerable good things. You may not have done your laundry, you may have not done the dishes, you may have not taken care of the dog adequately. So you've lost all your video games, you've lost the ability to watch anything, you're not going to get to see this episode of Beast Wars, and you're going to cry about it a little bit, I'm sure. And then vicariously collect all of them as an adult because you can. But I always had my books. And I think I always had my sketchbooks as well. I could always draw. And so there was always an escape. And I think this was really wise from my mother's perspective. And I'm thinking about it now as a parent. When my daughter gets in trouble and has to go to her room and spend some time there in a timeout, I don't take her books away. And I'm very hesitant to ever take her books away because books are a wonderful thing and they open our brains to all kinds of new situations. And there might just simply be some justification there. Sometimes pieces of our childhood that we look back on fondly that we think our parents did a good job with, we're hesitant to really evaluate. I'm hesitant to do that differently because I think the way my mom did it was really smart. And I think that is maybe a reason enough. You know, parenting is so complicated and so weird. There's so many facets that you have to process, and your kids are kind of like you, but not entirely like you, obviously. So whenever you can kind of skip some thinking and cheat a little bit and just be like, you know, this strategy worked for mom, I'm going to go ahead and do it. I think that there's a lot to be said for that. And there's a lot of grace to be given because parenting is complicated. It can be very difficult, not always, but it is always complicated because you're dealing with humans. I ran into a lot of this with teaching. It's a lot of the reason why teachers, when they get home at the end of the day, are so exhausted. It's why teachers need to have the summer or no one would do the job. Because your product, if you want to treat it that way, is human beings, human minds. And that's perhaps a terrible way to think about it, but I also think it's kind of accurate. You are training people. You are teaching them math or science or art or literature. And your product becomes that student? Well, not really, because that would be really, really terrible and kind of leaning towards eugenics. But your product is kind of what that student is able to produce. And this is why a lot of teachers nowadays are evaluated to some extent based on their students' test scores, on the execution of a thing. I don't think this is great for a lot of reasons, but it is what our society is going for. And partially because the United States, everything is pretty much evaluated from a business standpoint and from an economical standpoint, and there's some relevance to that. But it's really difficult when you try to evaluate people, when you try to evaluate something as complicated as education. Can you really judge if a literature teacher has done their job exploring the complicated nature of humanity and characters by how well their students write? Is writing as important or more important than understanding the human condition, psychology, and how to interact with other people? I would argue that it's not. I would argue that the most important subject in school is history, and after that it comes to writing and speaking, and then pretty much everything after that is kind of just even. I think you can make a decent argument that drawing is just as important as geometry for the average human being. How many people actually use geometry substantially after high school? And how many of those that do couldn't just Google something and figure it out quickly? Perhaps this is somewhat controversial, but I think that in reality, most of what you learn in high school is teaching you how to learn. It's teaching you how to think, how to process, how to acclimate to new environments, and those skills are tremendously beneficial. But in reality, most people don't use the really advanced things that they learn that are outside of their occupation. Most people don't spend much time over the course of the rest of their life with algebra, with geometry, with chemistry, with physics. Sure, those subjects might inform decisions and knowledge over the course of your life, but are they really that much more important than one another? It's difficult to say. I had a lot of time, and especially working at a classical school, working with people who taught Latin, Greek, drawing, painting, physics, and all manner of other classes, some of which are very typical and some of which are very non-typical. It was interesting to have these conversations to process what is actually most important, because we were looking at all these individuals that we were helping raise, all these individuals that we were trying to educate to prepare for life in some capacity alongside their parents, and then trying to figure out what that really looks like, how you do that effectively. I suppose the simple answer is, it's very, very complicated. There is no simple answer. And that's not very satisfactory, and that's why we continued to gnaw on these things and debate and think and process. And I'm not assuming that my answers or any of the things that I've rambled about for the last couple minutes are correct or true. They're simply my thoughts with a whole bunch of other people who did this for a living, processing what is actually necessary, what is best for these kids. And now, of course, having my own child, I'm thinking about them constantly. And one of the things that I try to put the most effort into is not assuming that I have the right answer. And that's difficult. We all tend to think that we have the right answer, or at least that's how I come at the world. I tend to think that my answer is right until it's proven wrong. I know this about myself, which means I'm constantly working on it. I'm constantly trying to forcefully unassume that I know what I'm talking about. And that's difficult, and I'm growing. I had the fortunate reality of working along people much, much smarter than myself for a long time. And I think, I don't know how you do this in life, but if you ever find yourself in a situation where you are definitively the least intelligent person in the room, good, you'll benefit from it tremendously. I didn't know that. I was arrogant as a child, and as I got into my first real jobs growing up, I was frequently the least intelligent person in the room from my perspective. And I think that was really good for me. It was really good for me to sit there and be like, I just need to shut up and listen, because these people know more about pretty much everything than I do. And it quieted me. It made my soul more temperate, and it made me more humble. And for that, I am eternally grateful, because I am a better person now because of it. And part of the reason I processed it from the direction that I processed it while I was teaching is I taught art. And obviously there's always this need to approve of or seek approval for what it is you do. I have less of that, perhaps, than others. But I still felt like if I had dedicated my life to teaching art, there should at least be some rudimentary justification for why I was doing what I was doing. And I spent a lot of time in my early years teaching, trying to come up with long, complicated arguments about why art is so important. And I think I might have at some point just kind of come to the conclusion that none of it's very important, and therefore art is just the same as everything else. Which is not a great perspective to have, and I certainly don't hold to it now, but I tried to process it from many, many different angles over time, which I think is beneficial. I have landed, of course, in a perspective where I think that art being one of the humanities, the exploration of the soul, the ability to explore and really be what it is to be human, is fundamentally important to our livelihood as a race. If you have the need personally to create, to be an artist, if you do not explore it, I fundamentally believe that you will be more miserable than if you do explore it. This is not a trait shared with everyone. Not everyone has this need to create in the same capacity that artists do, and that's okay. It's good that people are different. It's good that we are not all the same. It would be a terribly boring world if that were the case. And if you are an artist and you have the need to create, you have the need to put yourself into worlds, you enjoy playing video games, you like reading fantasy and science fiction, then welcome. You're just like so many of the rest of us. Strange weirdos who love to get out of their own heads because they tend to overthink and spend a lot of time in their own heads, and they become comfortable with it, and there's something beautiful about getting out of your comfort zone, about exploring things that are foreign to you, about thinking about what it would be like to be in a dilapidated building, eaten away by acid and random green and purple ichor. To sit there and contemplate jumping. What's down below? I don't know. And she doesn't either. As always, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this session. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.